Welcome to this exploration of one of history's most unsettling narratives. Today, we will venture into the gloom of the Appalachian Mountains, where a trio of siblings established a legacy that would resonate for decades. Martha, May, and Mabel. Three names that became inextricably linked with enigma and dread within the West Virginia highlands. This presentation is a fictional account crafted for entertainment. Any similarity to real individuals, whether living or deceased, is entirely accidental. The Appalachians have perpetually guarded their mysteries. Their thick woodlands and remote hollows provided an ideal backdrop for tales that challenged belief. At the dawn of the 20th century, this area was a place where modern statutes contended with older, unwritten rules, traditions born from an era when justice wore a different mask. Webster County was recognized for its coal mines and the resilience of its inhabitants. Whole clans resided in huts dotting the landscape, some so distant that reaching the closest settlement required hours of travel. It was within this environment that the three sisters were raised. Martha, the firstborn, possessed a piercing gaze that seemed to look straight through a person. May wore a grin that hid motives no one could interpret. Mabel, the youngest, had a keen wit that made up for her delicate appearance. Collectively, they constituted a power that almost no one could comprehend or challenge. Their family homestead was perched atop a ridge, encircled by ancient oaks that moaned when the wind blew. Locals claimed there was something off about that land, a sensation not justified by its remoteness alone. The year 1908 signaled the time when the sisters started to draw notice. Wayfarers using the main trail relayed odd occurrences. Some talked of meal invitations that concluded under strange circumstances. Others referenced commercial agreements that soured shortly after a visit to that farm. Yet these were merely murmurs, anecdotes shared in grimy saloons where men drank harsh liquor and attempted to rationalize their experiences. Nobody leveled direct charges. In a society where everyone relied on one another, making an accusation was a risky endeavor. The sisters held an unusual gift for herbal medicine. They understood every shrub on those slopes, every root, and every leaf. They concocted treatments that healed lingering illnesses and aches that physicians could not ease, but they also brewed other preparations, opaque vessels stored on ledges that few were permitted to view. Their standing expanded in two contradictory directions. To certain people, they were adept curers. To others, they symbolized something much more sinister. The path winding past their land was well trafficked in those days. Traders transported merchandise between towns, miners searched for new work, fortune hunters followed whispers of buried treasure in the hills. Numerous such travelers paused at the sisters' farm. Some never continued on their way. County ledgers display curious omissions. Names present in one file that vanish without any follow-up. Estates that transferred ownership without clear reason. Currency that moved through ambiguous paths. The regional sheriff was a man called William Thornton. He was aware of the tales, had listened to the gossip, but never uncovered sufficient proof. The legal system of that period demanded tangible evidence, a witness statement that nobody was prepared to offer. Secrecy shielded the sisters as effectively as their solitude did. When questioned, Martha would answer with that probing stare. May would smile in a manner that made a person's spine chill. Mabel would simply stay quiet, and that quietness was more powerful than any speech. We understand now that such mountains concealed more than was visible. The harsh terrain formed pockets of separation where alternative regulations existed. Clans cultivated their own forms of justice, their own creeds, and the three sisters appeared to have drafted theirs using an ink that nobody could remove. The sisters' property covered about 80 acres of rough ground, featuring a barn that looked to have been constructed many years before the primary residence. That barn held ordinary agricultural implements, but it also contained a basement that was known to very few. Those who sometimes labored for the sisters refrained from inquiring about that subterranean room. A tacit agreement existed that some areas were not to be investigated. Certain doors were not to be unlatched. The seasons dictated life in the Appalachians in severe fashion. Bitter winters cut off settlements for weeks. Springtimes brought downpours that transformed paths into streams of mire. Sweltering summers rendered mine labor even more intolerable. Fall was the period for gathering crops, when everyone needed to secure supplies for the frigid season. It was during one such autumn that a fabric salesman named Henry Walsh visited the sisters' farm. Henry was 42 years old and routinely journeyed from Charleston to the tiny inland hamlets. He hauled silks, cottons, and threads from abroad, which he vended for a handsome profit. His horse was favoring one leg when he approached the sisters' land, and Martha was in the yard as he halted. She provided water and a spot for the creature to recover. Henry accepted, thankful for the kindness in a locale where suspicion was standard. May cooked a supper of deer meat, potatoes, and bread baked on the premises. The discussion moved smoothly. Henry described the transformations he witnessed in the urban centers, the introduction of electric power in certain spots, and the motor cars that were starting to supplant horse-drawn wagons. The sisters listened with seeming engagement, posing queries that showed authentic interest. Mabel remarked that they seldom heard word from the world past the mountains. The evening progressed with the sound of the fire, stories that appeared innocuous. Henry commented that he was transporting goods valued at nearly $300, in addition to cash for procuring items from vendors on his route. It was a significant amount for 1,909, sufficient to purchase multiple small plots in that territory. He failed to observe the flicker in Martha's eyes as he disclosed this. May poured more of the homemade wine, asserting it was a unique family blend. The dark drink was sweet, carrying a flavor of the wild berries flourishing on the hillsides. Henry's speech started to falter after his third glass. His utterances became tangled. His thinking lost coherence. He blamed the exhaustion of his travels, the lengthy days on the trail. Mabel proposed he remain and rest for the night rather than press on in the darkness. It was hazardous to ride after sundown, particularly with an injured horse. Henry consented, his awareness already too muddled to scrutinize the abrupt hospitality. The events that followed remain wrapped in obscurity. We can only speculate, building from slivers of proof that would surface much later. May's wine contained qualities beyond that of simple alcohol. The sisters were familiar with herbs that brought on a profound slumber, leaving a person exposed for many hours. The barn's cellar had metal hooks suspended from the ceiling, chains fixed to the walls, and an earthen floor that soaked up fluids without a lasting mark. 3 weeks later, Henry's spouse reached out to the sheriff. Her husband had not come back, which was out of character. Henry was always punctual and invariably sent wires if he was delayed. Sheriff Thornton assembled a search party along the merchant's established route. They discovered his horse meandering close to the sisters' property, still saddled, but with no trace of the rider. When interrogated, the 3 women denied any encounter with Henry. Martha stated that numerous wayfarers used the road. It was impractical to recall everyone. The inquiry immediately met resistance it could not see. There was no corpse, no one who had seen anything, no proof of any wrongdoing. The jurisprudence of the era demanded more than simple conjecture to bring charges. The sheriff combed the land with a group of 6 deputies, yet they discovered only a commonplace homestead. The barn's underground room was vacant, scrubbed clean and carrying the potent odor of recently scattered lime. Martha clarified that they employed lime to manage odors from their livestock. It was a plausible justification, but the rumors continued to grow. Other traders started to bypass that path entirely. Some took lengthy, alternate routes to circumvent the sisters' land. Their standing gradually shifted from odd local healers to something much more alarming. Even so, there was no method to verify any of it. The Appalachian Mountains possessed a talent for making people vanish. Mishaps occurred. Wanderers became disoriented on the labyrinthine paths. Predators assaulted the incautious. There was always a seemingly logical reason for every vanishing. May continued to vend her remedies in the settlement. Mabel went to church each Sabbath. They were always well-groomed and courteous. Martha operated the farm with notable skill, her land yielding more than many larger neighboring spreads. They settled their taxes promptly, exchanged pleasant greetings with locals, and never created any public disturbance. It was this appearance of regularity that shielded them. Nobody wished to accept that women so woven into the social fabric could be accountable for the grim whispers echoing in the taverns. The fall of 1,910 brought with it an early cold snap. The trees shed their foliage sooner than usual, leaving the highlands looking gaunt beneath leaden clouds. It was around this period that a Charleston journal printed a story about travelers disappearing on the backcountry roads. The writing did not specify any names, but it outlined a disquieting trend. The subjects were always solitary men, always in possession of cash or valuable items, and always within the same sector of Webster County. The newspaper piece sent ripples of disquiet through the mountain settlements. Individuals started linking points that had previously seemed disconnected. A miner who had vanished en route to see his kin, a traveling evangelist who never arrived at his next revival, a vendor of farming implements whose horse was discovered untethered and grazing. They had all journeyed through that identical territory. They all carried items of worth. They all simply evaporated like dawn fog in the valleys. Martha, May, and Mabel carried on with their lives with a calmness that verged on provocation. They were present at local gatherings, donated to the church coffers, and took part in communal improvement efforts. May had even begun offering stitching tutorials to local ladies, instructing them in intricate patterns handed down from her grandmother. Mabel tended a plot that was the admiration of all her neighbors, producing vegetables that grew unusually large and robust, even when other gardens failed. Martha bartered livestock with the acumen of a seasoned trader, consistently securing superior rates than other farmers. This mask of conventionality was their most powerful defense. How could anyone distrust women who appeared so unremarkable, so thoroughly incorporated? Sheriff Thornton bore the burden of his aggravation. He was sure something was amiss, but conviction was insufficient. He required physical proof, and the Highlands did not willingly surrender their mysteries. The severe Appalachian landscape could conceal countless things. Thick woods extended for miles without a single path. Natural caverns punctured the hillsides like unhealed gashes in the stone. In 1911, an incident altered the quiet understanding that had safeguarded the sisters. A young attorney named Thomas Reed came to the region from Pittsburgh. He had been engaged by the families of 3 men who had disappeared on separate trading paths, yet all routes converged on that specific part of Webster County. Thomas was not from the mountains. He wore city-tailored suits, spoke with an urban inflection, and carried a leather case filled with meticulously ordered papers. He represented a kind of formal authority that did not defer to the unspoken rules of country life. Thomas spent weeks questioning inhabitants, scrutinizing county archives, and charting the last known whereabouts of the missing individuals. He found that many had spoken of intentions to stop at the sisters' farm. Some had even left notes stating they would accept lodging there. Thomas started constructing an argument founded on repeated patterns and situational details, rather than on direct testimony. It was a hazardous tactic, but he trusted that a jury could be persuaded by the cumulative weight of the circumstances. Martha learned of Thomas's inquiries before he had even completed gathering his data. News moved swiftly in tiny communities, particularly when it involved outsiders posing uncomfortable questions. She debated with her sisters on a tempestuous night, while thunder rumbled between the peaks. May contended they should be more careful, perhaps cease their activities for a time. Mabel proposed they could use their sway over certain individuals to obstruct the lawyer's progress. Martha, however, possessed a different strategy. She decided the most effective defense was to meet Thomas head-on. She invited him to supper at the farm, stating she wished to address his queries transparently. Thomas was taken aback by the invitation, but he accepted. He viewed it as a chance to observe the women closely, to perhaps detect something his documents could not show. He informed several people in town of his plans, ensuring many knew his location for that evening. It was an elementary precaution, but it also showed he was not as gullible as he might have seemed. The evening meal was a meticulously prepared event. The sisters set the table with a fine linen cloth, burnished silver cutlery, and candles that threw shifting shades upon the walls. The food was exquisite roasted lamb with fragrant herbs, produce from Mabel's garden, and oven-warm bread. Martha directed the discussion with keen intelligence, parrying direct inquiries with replies that seemed helpful, yet disclosed nothing of substance. May served the courses with measured smiles. Mabel stayed largely silent, watching Thomas with a focus that unsettled him. Thomas noted that his wineglass was replenished often, but he drank very little of it. He had studied compounds that could be introduced to drinks without leaving a detectable flavor. The sisters noticed his wariness, and this introduced a subtle strain into the air. The dialogue remained polite on its surface, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of menace that none of those present acknowledged openly. Thomas eventually expressed his gratitude for their hospitality and took his leave. his wagon vanishing into the blackness of the road. But Thomas was not a man who surrendered easily. He started petitioning state officials to dispatch independent agents. He wrote letters to major newspapers, elaborating on the sequence of disappearances. He succeeded in arousing the interest of a Charleston district attorney. The net was drawing shut, slowly yet inexorably. The sisters sensed the shift in the atmosphere, like creatures who perceive an approaching squall before the first drop of rain falls. The approaching storm clouds seemed to mirror the growing danger. May suggested they should depart the farm, liquidate their assets, and establish new lives in an unfamiliar territory. The nation was wide open. There were frontier lands out west where a person's history was never examined. Martha dismissed the notion with fierce intensity. To run would be a confession of wrongdoing, and she refused to desert all they had established through such effort. The farm was their lawful property. That ground had been paid for with their labor and suffering. Mabel sided with Martha, though her reasoning was distinct. She was convinced they could twist the circumstances to benefit them, leveraging the relationships they had nurtured over the decades. The spring of 1912 delivered relentless downpours that swelled creeks into violent flows. A particularly devastating deluge struck the area, wiping out crossings and cutting off multiple settlements. It was during this flooding that an unforeseen event occurred. A mudslide on the land bordering the sisters' property revealed a section of a gully normally concealed by thick undergrowth. A homesteader checking his damaged fence lines spotted something odd in the churned-up soil. Bones were poking out from the muck. At first, the man assumed they belonged to a wild creature, but their form gave him reason to hesitate. He summoned other locals, and they started to excavate with caution. What they uncovered froze the blood of men familiar with the rugged mountain existence. They were human skeletons, several of them, interred in a manner indicating rush and neglect. Rotting fabric still clung to some of the bones. There were metallic fasteners and clasps that had endured the elements. Sheriff Thornton was summoned at once. He appeared with a bigger contingent, which now included the Charleston district attorney, whom Thomas had convinced to look into the matter. The digging uncovered a minimum of 5 distinct skeletons, perhaps additional ones. The site was officially on the neighboring plot, but it was near enough to the sisters' border to provoke severe doubts. Early assessments of the remains revealed alarming indicators, breaks that looked to be from heavy impacts, grooves on rib cages hinting at stab wounds. Word of the find spread with incredible speed. The local populace was plunged into disbelief and terror. Individuals who had coexisted with the sisters for decades questioned how they had missed the signals. Others recollected peculiar instances, prolonged stares, awkward pauses, and offers that now felt loaded with dark intent. The community's social structure started to crumble under the gravity of the discovery. Martha, May, and Mabel were brought in for formal questioning the next day. Sheriff Thornton came with 6 officers, a demonstration of power that communicated the gravity of the event. The sisters did not struggle. They did not object. They merely collected their outer garments and walked quietly to the wagon. For the whole trip, Martha maintained her penetrating stare on the passing scenery, while May muttered under her breath, and Mabel sat perfectly still, like a figure carved from stone. The questioning extended for many hours. Thomas Reed was there, alongside the prosecutor and 2 state functionaries who had journeyed specifically for the proceedings. They posed questions about every missing wayfarer, about the farm's closeness to the burial site, about the concoctions May created, about the barn's construction. Martha replied to everything in an even tone, never faltering, never confessing to anything beyond common knowledge. She was a farmer. Her home was in that county. Peddlers came through regularly. She held no authority over what others buried on their own land. The argument was straightforward yet potent. The corpses were not on their land. There was no forensic proof linking the sisters to the skeletons. No eyewitness had observed them commit any act. Everything was inferential, founded on conjecture and happenstance. The legal framework of 1912 required more than that for a guilty verdict, particularly in a proceeding that would draw such notoriety. May and Mabel adhered to Martha's lead, providing brief answers. They never offered extra information, preserving a demeanor that vexed the questioners. Thomas understood he required more. He went back to the farm with a search party, this time bearing a formal warrant. to scrutinize every centimeter of the grounds. They labored for 3 full days, digging, inspecting, hunting for any clue that could conclusively prove the case. They discovered glass containers holding unidentifiable fluids, desiccated herbs suspended in the loft, standard agricultural implements, but nothing that demonstrated homicide. The barn's subfloor had questionable scratches on its support timbers, but scratches could have 100 harmless origins. The earth had been turned over many times, but on a farm, the soil is always being disturbed. Thomas's aggravation increased in direct proportion to his conviction of their culpability. He had a definitive sequence of events, a consistent geographical link, multiple vanishings connected to that locale. But juries did not convict on sequences alone. They required physical proof, admissions of guilt, or people who saw the crime, and the Appalachian Mountains provided none of these things. The community became split. Some were absolutely certain of the sisters' guilt. Others contended they were casualties of collective panic. In the end, solitary women always attracted doubt in a society that viewed female self-sufficiency with suspicion. The prosecutor opted to gamble. He brought the case to trial based on the accumulated indirect evidence. He hoped a jury from the area would grasp the subtleties of the situation. It was a contentious choice that polarized the populace. Metropolitan newspapers reported on the case with the period's typical sensationalism, crafting stories that bore little resemblance to the truth. Some depicted the sisters as backwoods sorceresses, others as businesswomen being unfairly targeted by a backward community. The proceedings started in September 1912 as the foliage on the slopes began to turn. The courthouse was filled to capacity with spectators who had journeyed from distant shires to attend. Martha, May, and Mabel sat together, dressed modestly, their hair neatly tied back, their faces composed. Their defense attorney was an elderly gentleman named Edmund Price, renowned for taking on hopeless cases with dazzling oratory. He dismantled each element of the prosecution's argument with meticulous exactness. Where were the eyewitnesses? No one saw the sisters harm anyone. Where was the evidence connecting the skeletons directly to them? The land where they were discovered was not theirs. How could they verify that the mysterious bottles contained toxins and not simple homemade cures? Every farmer in the territory had similar jars. Why presume ordinary tools were employed for nefarious purposes? Edmund Price constructed reasonable doubt, piece by piece, until he had built a wall the prosecution could not scale. Thomas Reed gave his testimony regarding his investigation about the pattern he had identified. But under the defense's intense questioning, he had to concede that patterns were not concrete evidence. Yes, numerous individuals had vanished in that region. Yes, they had all traveled near the sisters' farm. But the mountains were an immense and hazardous domain. Mishaps were frequent. Predators were a perpetual danger. Outlaws worked in the isolated parts. There were countless explanations besides the one the prosecution was putting forward. The jury debated for 2 entire days. The strain in the town was thick enough to feel, with factions forming on opposing sides of the issue. Some clamored for justice for the vanished, while others feared the conviction of potentially innocent women. The missing. Others upheld the principle that one is innocent until proven guilty. When the jurors finally came back, their decision was delivered in 3 simple words that reverberated through the silent chamber. Not guilty. The prosecution had been unable to prove its argument beyond a shadow of a doubt. Martha shut her eyes for a brief moment. It was the sole indication of any feeling she displayed. May permitted herself a faint, discreet smile. Mabel's expression remained unreadable and still. The acquittal triggered intense responses. A segment of the townspeople celebrated the triumph of the legal system over collective panic. Another segment felt profoundly betrayed by the very institutions meant to keep them safe. Sheriff Thornton exited the courthouse with a look of utter defeat, aware he could never assemble a stronger case than the one that had just failed. Thomas Reed departed for Pittsburgh several days later, carrying with him the sour taste of a fight he had lost. The sisters went back to their farm, legally free to resume their existence, but this liberty came with a hidden cost. Their standing in the community was permanently damaged. Neighbors who had once bartered with them now crossed the street to avoid a meeting. The women who had attended May's stitching tutorials ceased their visits. The local pastor quietly hinted that it might be preferable for them to conduct their worship in private. The town shunned them in quiet yet crushing methods. They were free in the eyes of the law, but captive to endless suspicion. It was then that Martha decided they would sell the property and depart, not from any admission of fault, but because staying meant a life beneath a perpetual, accusing stare. The sale was swift, and for a sum well below its true worth. Nobody desired a long-term association with that particular parcel of land. With the proceeds, the three sisters purchased rail passes heading west, where the frontier still promised obscurity for those wanting a new beginning. They left the Appalachians on a misty October morning in 1913, taking with them only their luggage and secrets they would never reveal. The locomotive raced across valleys and flatlands with a mesmerizing rhythm. Each passing mile carried the sisters farther from the highlands they had called home their entire lives. Martha watched the scenery transform through the damp glass, the thick woods yielding to boundless grasslands. May turned the pages of a novel without truly absorbing the words, her gaze lost in reflections no one could interpret. Mabel dozed with her head resting on her elder sister's shoulder, finally at ease after months of unending strain. They had endured the examination of the court, but the price of that endurance was a debt still being tallied. The trip lasted nearly a week, with pauses in towns that sprouted like fungi after a downpour. The nation was changing at a breakneck pace. Factories were supplanting farmland. Automobiles vied with horse-drawn carriages on the main thoroughfares. The sisters observed this modern world with a blend of awe and wariness. They were from a past age, a time where old-world customs still dictated how people interacted. Now, they had to evolve or fade into obscurity. They selected a settlement, called Silverton, tucked into the lower slopes of Colorado's Rocky Mountains. It was a location with its own legacy of mineral extraction and westward growth, a place where people arrived chasing wealth and frequently discovered only despair. The residents were a varied collection of prospectors, traders, drifters, and individuals escaping complicated histories. In Silverton, nobody posed too many questions. Everyone had something to conceal or to leave behind. It was the ideal setting for three women needing to craft new lives. They purchased a simple, two-story timber house on the town's edge, featuring a large root cellar. The yard was not as expansive as their previous one, but it contained a plot sufficient for Mabel to cultivate her herbs. Martha used a portion of their remaining funds to establish a small mercantile that served the miners and their households. May built a standing as an adept dressmaker, providing services that few other women in the area could offer. They inserted themselves into the community with deliberate caution, being friendly but never forming deep bonds. The initial months in Silverton were a time of careful observation and adaptation. The sisters learned to maneuver through social customs that were unfamiliar to them. The town moved at a quicker tempo. People were more blunt, less entangled in generations-old duties. There was a certain liberty in this, but also a distinct sense of isolation. Back in the Appalachians, even with the ostracism, they had belonged to a larger whole. Here, they were perpetual outsiders, endured but never fully embraced. Martha watched the patrons in her store with scrupulous care. She analyzed their habits, pinpointing who had cash to spare, who was in dire need, and who might be easily influenced. Old routines were difficult to abandon, and Martha had never been one to relinquish advantages easily. May worked in her tailoring space, her fingers guiding the needle with a hypnotic rhythm. She, too, observed, listening to talks and committing to memory details others would deem trivial. Mabel started visiting the town's reading room, consuming texts on botany, chemistry, and pharmacology. Her garden thrived with varieties not indigenous to the region, specimens she nurtured for particular reasons. In 1914, Europe descended into a conflict that would eventually consume the globe. News arrived via newspapers and telegraph wires, tales of far-off fighting and death on an industrial scale. The war felt abstract to the people of Silverton, a catastrophe happening in another world. But the conflict had a way of touching even the most secluded spots. Costs increased, commodities grew scarce, and local men started leaving for military encampments. Martha's shop prospered because of the shortages. She had a gift for obtaining merchandise when others failed, for brokering good deals, for capitalizing on the chances the war presented. Some murmured that her tactics were dubious, that she benefited from the misery of others. Martha dismissed these comments. Commerce was commerce, and ethics were a luxury she had never been able to indulge. May broadened her sewing work, mending army gear, and creating garments for women whose husbands were abroad. Mabel continued her botanical research, formulating treatments to ease the aches and worries the war intensified. It was during this time that the sisters encountered Samuel Garrett. He was a mining engineer, a man of 35 with scarred hands and a world-weary gaze. Samuel had a standing as a solitary figure, a man who preferred the company of mineral deposits and explosives to that of other people. He began to be a regular at Martha's store, purchasing his supplies every week, always courteous but reserved. Martha noted that he carried a significant amount of currency, that his attire was of a finer make than most prospectors, and that he appeared to have no kin or close friends. The exchanges between Martha and Samuel started out trivially, with remarks about the climate and market costs. Slowly, they deepened into more meaningful dialogue. Samuel spoke of gold-bearing seams he had located on solo expeditions, of schemes to launch his own mining operation once he had saved enough funds. Martha listened with an attention that seemed sincere, posing sharp questions that impressed the engineer. He was unaccustomed to women who comprehended geology and the economics of minerals. He started to view Martha not just as a shopkeeper, but as a mental peer. May observed the growing connection between Martha and Samuel with a degree of unease. She knew her sister all too well. She understood how Martha functioned, how she pinpointed prospects and seized them without a second thought. Mabel, for her part, saw Samuel as a potential complication. Solitary men with money were always complex. They lacked social ties to restrain them, but they also lacked anyone who would take notice if they were to disappear, if they were to vanish. It was a precarious calculation that demanded meticulous assessment. Samuel started joining the sisters for supper at their home from time to time. He appreciated their companionship, the stimulating discussions, and the skillfully cooked meals. Martha possessed a talent for making him feel unique, for displaying a genuine interest in his tales without appearing sycophantic. May contributed a subtle grace, always mindful of a visitor's comfort. Mabel stayed largely silent, but on the occasions she did speak, her comments were perceptive and left a lasting impression. On an especially frigid winter evening in January of 1915, Samuel revealed that he had made a major find. He had located a gold-bearing seam on an unclaimed plot a few miles outside of town. Nobody else was aware of it. He had kept it to himself while he worked on securing the mineral rights. With some good fortune and the proper backing, it had the potential to make him an extremely wealthy man. Martha inquired as to how much capital he estimated the vein held. Samuel chuckled and said it was hard to be exact, but it would easily be valued at over $10,000, perhaps substantially more. The figure lingered in the room like the echo of a struck gong. $10,000 was a massive amount of money, enough to ensure a comfortable existence for decades. Martha shot a swift, meaningful look at May, a wordless language they had perfected over many years. Mabel observed Samuel with a fresh, sharp focus, evaluating and computing. Samuel, oblivious to the slight shift in the mood, continued speaking about his ambitions, about how beneficial it would be to have reliable associates to assist in the enterprise. Martha suggested that they invest in Samuel's venture. They had a small amount of savings, not a vast sum, but sufficient to cover the preliminary expenses. In exchange, they requested a percentage of the eventual earnings. Samuel was taken aback by the proposition, but also felt validated. It was a confirmation of his discovery, an acknowledgement of his skill. He consented to form a company, sealing the agreement with a handshake and a whiskey toast served by May in cut crystal tumblers that had been their mother's. The subsequent weeks were a whirlwind of detailed preparation. Samuel charted the mine, estimated the cost of machinery, and projected extraction timelines. Martha provided her acumen in fiscal management. May offered her talents in coordination, and Mabel proposed techniques for assaying the ore's quality. They functioned effectively as a unit, each one's strengths balancing the others. Samuel began to speak of a future that included the three sisters, not merely as commercial partners, but as the family he had chosen. However, there was an issue Samuel failed to grasp. The sisters did not possess actual capital to contribute. Martha's offer had been a lure, a tactic to foster closeness and create an emotional, bond and expectation. They required Samuel's expertise, the precise location of the mine, the legal rights he was procuring. Once they possessed that intelligence, Samuel would become expendable. It was a well-worn pattern, perfected in the Appalachian highlands. The scenery was different, but the fundamental nature of the play was the same. The spring of 1915 brought thunderstorms to the mountains, transforming streams into rushing torrents. Samuel was enthusiastic about the partnership's progress. The mining documents were nearly complete, and the required machinery had been purchased. He trusted the sisters utterly, a faith that Martha nurtured with the care of a devoted horticulturist. May cooked intricate meals every Friday, establishing a custom that Samuel began to look forward to all week. Mabel had even started speaking more freely, sharing carefully curated anecdotes from her youth in the Eastern Highlands. Yet, something began to shift in the relationship between the sisters. Martha detected a wavering in May, a reservation that had not been there previously. During a private talk in the cellar while arranging canned goods, May voiced her doubts. Samuel was different from the others. He authentically cared for them, viewed them as individuals, not just as instruments. Could they not simply maintain a truthful partnership, operate the mine legitimately, and divide the profits as promised? Martha was quiet for a long while, startled by the directness of the challenge. It was the first instance May had so openly questioned their methods. Mabel joined the discussion with a practical viewpoint. They lacked real funds to invest. Samuel would uncover that fact eventually. When he did, the partnership would disintegrate, and they would be left with nothing. Worse, he might start asking questions about their history. He might investigate their origins, their reasons for leaving West Virginia. Secrets had a habit of surfacing when people felt deceived. The reasoning was sound, yet May still resisted. There was something about Samuel that resonated with a part of her she believed had been long extinguished, an ember of decency that endured despite everything. Martha was faced with a complex choice. She could see that May was emotionally involved, and that represented a threat. Feelings created vulnerabilities. Vulnerabilities led to errors. She proposed a different path. They would maintain the partnership with Samuel for the present, learning all there was to know about the mine's operation and acquiring the necessary understanding. When the moment was appropriate, they would simply vanish, taking the knowledge with them and leaving Samuel with a financial setback, but with his life. It was not an ideal resolution, but it would prevent what could have been a far darker outcome for the engineer. May accepted this middle ground with visible alleviation. Mabel concurred reluctantly, though she considered the strategy hazardous. Leaving a living witness, someone who could talk about them and connect events, contradicted every lesson they had ever learned. But Martha was the eldest, the acknowledged leader, and her judgments were rarely contested. The balance between the three had always functioned this way, an unspoken chain of command that was almost never directly questioned. The months that followed were a peculiar interlude of domestic routine. Samuel spent increasing time at their house, occasionally staying into the evening to discuss plans or simply to relish their company. He started bringing small presents, wildflowers for Mabel, high-quality cloth for May, a scarce volume on trade for Martha. These were acts of sincere fondness, not efforts to sway or control. The sisters reciprocated with growing cordiality, and at a certain point, the performance began to feel less like an act and more like actuality. Martha found herself enjoying the evenings on the porch, where Samuel smoked his pipe and recounted tales of exploring deep caverns. May privately admitted she looked forward to Fridays when she would cook her distinctive dishes. Mabel discovered she took pleasure in conversing with Samuel about botany. He had an unexpected understanding of curative plants learned from native tribes. They were perilously close to forming a genuine bond with this man who was intended to be merely a tool. In July of 1915, Samuel finally secured all the required legal rights and was prepared to commence the mining operation. He suggested a celebration, a special dinner followed by a trip to the mine so the sisters could see the location for the first time. Martha agreed, aware this was a chance to judge the true worth of the discovery. If the vein was as substantial as Samuel asserted, they would have a choice to make. If it was an overstatement or a mirage, they could simply dissolve the partnership amicably. The visit to the mine was revelatory. The site was situated in a secluded gulch, encircled by stone cliffs and reachable only by a slender path. Samuel had completed extensive preliminary work, digging the initial shaft and setting up timber braces. He showed the sisters the gold vein he had found, a gleaming, amber-colored line meandering through the rock face, through the dull, grey stone. Martha ran her fingers over the precious metal, sensing the heavy promise it held. May observed Samuel's fervent excitement as he spoke of the future they would construct. Mabel was already internally estimating the labor required to pull a substantial amount of gold from the earth. Samuel detailed how they would need to employ extra hands, purchase more advanced machinery, and set up a refining operation. All of this demanded a considerable upfront expenditure, more than his own resources could cover. It was the moment when Martha should have confessed that she lacked the capital she had promised. But as she began to speak, May cut her off. She proposed they could sell the general store and put every cent into the mining venture. It was a tremendous gamble, but if the vein was as plentiful as it appeared, the reward would justify the risk. Martha was taken aback by the idea. Selling the store meant a full commitment, destroying any path of retreat. Yet she also recognized the sense in it. If they were genuinely attempting to alter their course, to live a different kind of life, it required complete dedication. They could not remain straddled between two worlds. Samuel was deeply touched by this show of faith, hugging each of the sisters with heartfelt thanks. In that instant, beneath the vast Colorado sky, the direction of their lives was irrevocably altered. The months that followed were defined by relentless labor. Martha sold the shop for a reasonable sum and funneled the proceeds into the mining operation. May shut down her tailoring business to devote herself entirely to managing the mine's logistics. Mabel applied her understanding of chemistry to enhance the suspi, ore extraction methods. Samuel labored alongside them, instructing, learning, and building an enterprise that was greater than any single one of them. For the first time in their lives, the sisters were constructing something legitimate, something that instilled a sense of pride. The mine started to show a return. Not the instant riches Samuel had dreamed of, but a consistent yield of gold that, when sold, provided a respectable livelihood. They hired a few reliable men, established efficient systems, and carefully expanded the operation. The partnership flourished not just financially, but on a personal level. Samuel proposed to Martha on a chilly November evening, presenting her with a simple gold band he had fashioned himself from their first successful extraction. Martha looked at the ring, then at Samuel, and finally at her sisters. May smiled, her eyes glistening with emotion. Mabel gave a quiet, approving nod. Martha said yes, a word she had never pictured herself saying, a pledge she never believed she would make. The wedding was an intimate affair in a local chapel, with few guests but profound significance. The sisters wore gowns that May had meticulously stitched for the occasion. Samuel wore a suit he reserved for momentous events. The officiating minister remarked that he had never witnessed a couple who seemed so perfectly matched. The life that unfolded afterward was strangely conventional. Martha and Samuel lived in the main house. May and Mabel kept their own bedrooms, but shared daily meals and duties. The mine continued its steady production, not generating vast wealth, but ensuring a stable and comfortable living. They became an accepted part of the Silverton community, recognized for their diligent work and principled business dealings. People who had initially regarded the sisters with wariness began to accept that perhaps they had misread them, that these women from the East were precisely who they appeared to be. But the past never truly vanishes. It lies dormant, waiting for the correct conditions to emerge. The years 1916 and 1917 ushered in deep transformations, not just for the sisters, but for the entire globe. The war in Europe escalated, devouring resources and lives on an unimaginable scale. When the United States finally joined the conflict, even a remote town like Silverton felt the repercussions. Men departed for faraway fronts. Women took on roles once reserved for men, and the entire national economy shifted to support the war machine. The sisters and Samuel's mine prospered in this climate, as precious metals were always in demand, in war and in peace. Martha, to her own astonishment, had adapted to the role of a wife. She found solace in the shared rhythm of domestic life, in the constant company of someone who sincerely cared for her welfare. Samuel was a considerate husband who respected her judgment and valued her input in managing the mine. They had forged a partnership that transcended business, a connection Martha had never before known. For the first time, she comprehended what other women meant when they spoke of marriage. It was not a cage or a duty, but a collaboration between equals. May flourished in a different manner. Freed from the incessant strain of upholding false fronts, she rediscovered a love for handcrafts. She began creating intricate quilts, pieces that narrated stories through their designs and hues. Each quilt was a unique artistic creation, and she soon earned a reputation that extended beyond Silverton. Women from adjacent towns commissioned her work, willing to pay high prices for creations that blended aesthetic beauty with deep sentiment. May had discovered a mode of expression that was wholly her own, untouched by the darkness of former times. Mabel pursued her botanical research with fresh dedication. She converted the cellar of her house into a makeshift laboratory where she experimented with plant extracts and chemical mixtures. Her objective had entirely transformed. Instead of devising substances to disable or hurt, she concentrated on creating medicines that cured and soothed pain. Mabel began providing her preparations to the local physician, who was astounded by their efficacy. She possessed a real gift for pharmacology, a knowledge that was finally being directed toward benevolent ends. The lives of the three sisters had changed so utterly that it sometimes felt as if they were living the lives of other people. The memories of the Appalachian mountains, of the wayfarers who never reached their destinations, of the trial and their flight, it all seemed to belong to a different volume, written by former versions of themselves who no longer existed. Martha seldom dwelled on those days, and when she did, it was with an unease she quickly pushed aside. May suffered from occasional bad dreams, waking up damp with sweat and shaking. But Samuel was always there to soothe her, without posing questions she could not answer. Mabel managed her past through relentless work, keeping her mind too occupied to drift into perilous recollections. In 1918, influenza began to ravage the nation with terrible force. The pandemic claimed more lives than the war, showing no mercy to the young or old, the wealthy or the poor. Silverton was not spared. Whole households fell ill. The town doctor was swamped, and the limited medical facilities were quickly overrun. It was during this calamity that Mabel assumed the role of a community healer. Her remedies could not cure the flu, but they alleviated the symptoms, brought down fevers, and made it easier for patients to breathe. She worked without rest, visiting the sick, preparing treatments, and offering solace where conventional medicine was failing. Martha and May supported Mabel as best they could. Martha coordinated a network to distribute food to families under quarantine. May sewed cloth masks, even before health officials widely recommended their use. Samuel used his connections to procure scarce medical supplies. Their home became an informal headquarters for crisis relief, a place the community knew they could turn to for aid. The work was draining, both physically and emotionally, but it was also restorative. Every life preserved, every family assisted, seemed to settle a debt in the silent moral ledger the sisters kept. The pandemic eventually receded, leaving profound grief in its wake, but it had also revealed an unexpected resilience in ordinary people. Silverton had mourned the loss of nearly 50 of its people, a devastating toll for a settlement of its size. Those who remained emerged from the crisis forever altered, with a new, stark understanding of life's fragility and a deeper appreciation for human bonds. The sisters were now viewed as local heroines, women who had jeopardized their own well-being to aid their neighbors. The town's thankfulness was evident in countless small acts of kindness and respect. It was during this period of healing that an unanticipated guest appeared in Silverton. He was a man in his middle years, wearing a weathered hat and carrying a scuffed leather case. He stepped off the train on a spring afternoon in 1919. He asked a few careful questions around town and eventually found his way to the sisters' home. When Martha opened the door, a chill ran through her. The man was a newspaperman from West Virginia, one who had reported on their trial all those years ago. He gave his name as Robert Chen, and his smile did not touch his eyes. Robert explained he was authoring a volume about unresolved crimes from the Appalachian region. He had pursued faint trails, interviewed scores of individuals, and tracked the sisters' path through public archives and the recollections of railway workers. It had taken him 4 years to locate them, but his doggedness had finally succeeded. He insisted he had no interest in having them arrested or exposing them to the law. The case was long closed. Proof had been lost. Those who had testified were gone or scattered, but he wanted their account the unvarnished truth, unshaped by courtrooms or sensational newsprint. Martha invited him inside, her mind swiftly weighing their limited choices. She could reject everything, claim he had confused them with other women. But Robert produced pictures from the trial, press cuttings, and papers that confirmed who they were. Denial was pointless. May entered from the kitchen and went still at the sight of their visitor. Mabel came down the stairs moments later, analyzing the predicament with a detached coolness. Samuel was at the mine and would not return for hours. They were alone with this phantom from their history. Robert took a seat in the parlor, declined an offer of coffee, and went directly to his purpose. He wanted to know what had truly transpired in the Appalachians. How many wayfarers had actually vanished? How had they managed it? What had begun it all? He pledged them secrecy if they cooperated, vowing to alter names and distinguishing details in his book. But he required the truth, or at the very least, their perspective on it. It was a bizarre proposal, a blend of menace and chance. If they refused, he could publish theories built on indirect proof. If they agreed, they could exert some influence over the tale that was told. Martha looked at her sisters, a silent dialogue that had been their language for a lifetime. May gave a slight shake of her head, advising refusal. Mabel remained impassive, leaving the final choice to Martha. The eldest sister fixed her gaze on Robert, studying him with a concentration that made him glance away. She saw ambition in him, but also something more. He sincerely wished to comprehend, not merely to capitalize on their story. It was a crucial difference. Martha began to speak, her voice quiet but steady. She recounted the profound poverty of the highlands, of how women alone had few respectable paths to survive. She spoke of the first peddler who had come to their farm, a man who had made improper advances, who had treated them as if they were goods for the taking. She described how they had acted to defend themselves, how the body had been interred in a blind panic, and how they had realized nobody would come searching for him. Robert listened, captivated, scribbling occasional notes. May interjected, adding the emotional weight Martha had left out. She spoke of the perpetual dread of how their society viewed self-sufficient women with mistrust and animosity. She clarified that every act that followed was an effort to shield that first, terrible secret, like a vortex from which they could not break free. Mabel offered a more dispassionate examination, outlining the practicalities, the herbs they had employed, the systems they had perfected. She displayed no regret, only laid out the facts as a researcher might detail a procedure. Robert listened for 3 hours, posing, the occasional question for clarity. When they fell silent, he shut his notepad and let out a heavy breath. He said it was not his role to pass judgment, that he had learned more about human complication in that single afternoon than in all his years as a journalist. He renewed his vow of anonymity, stating the account would be presented as a fictional story inspired by real events, with no true names or precise locales. He thanked them for their candor and rose to leave. But Martha stopped him with a question of her own. Why had he not simply turned them in to the law? Robert gave a sorrowful smile and replied that justice was a far more intricate notion than he had been taught in school. He had watched the sisters laboring through the pandemic, had heard the stories of the lives they had saved, had witnessed the atonement they were living. To shatter that now would serve no good purpose. The dead would not return, and the women before him were not the same as those who had committed the crimes long ago. Sometimes, he said, true justice was allowing people who had changed to live out their redemption. Robert departed on the next train, carrying with him a story he had promised to treat with respect and empathy. The sisters were left emotionally spent, having confronted a past that had drained reserves of strength they did not know they still possessed. When Samuel returned from the mine that evening, he discovered the 3 of them sitting together in the darkened parlor. He asked if something was wrong, but Martha only shook her head and requested he grant them some time alone. Samuel honored her wish, concerned but trusting they would confide in him when they were ready. That night, the 3 sisters held a conversation they had deferred for many years. They debated whether they ought to tell Samuel the full truth of their history. May contended that he had a right to know, that a relationship constructed on things left unsaid was not entirely honest. Mabel maintained that some secrets were best kept buried, that burdening him with this knowledge would only cause him suffering. Martha was divided, seeing wisdom in both viewpoints. No decision was reached that night, nor the next. It became a matter that would linger unresolved, suspended over them like a haze that never fully cleared. The years that followed brought changes no one could have foreseen. The 1,920 seconds arrived with a new vitality, an age of jazz and economic boom. Automobiles began to crowd streets once ruled by horses. Wireless radios carried voices across vast distances. Silverton expanded, its numbers swelling as tales of mining fortunes attracted new families. The mine operated by Samuel and the sisters grew considerably, now employing more than 20 workers and yielding quantities that surpassed their most hopeful early estimates. Martha had become an esteemed personality in local commercial affairs. She possessed an innate skill for deal-making, knowing precisely when to press an advantage and when to concede, and she understood the minds of those who bought and sold. Other mine owners often sought her counsel, and she became an unofficial advisor to several operations. This prosperity brought a financial security the sisters had never before experienced. They could afford fine garments, furnish their home with quality pieces, and even hire help for the more arduous household chores. May had released a small book on stitching methods and quilt patterns. The publication was humble, produced by a local press, but it attracted unexpected notice. Women from across Colorado and surrounding states sent for copies, writing letters seeking her guidance. Some even journeyed to Silverton to learn from her directly. May founded a small school for crafts, instructing groups of 4 or 5 pupils at a time. She found she had a passion for teaching, for imparting skills in a manner that enhanced the lives of others. Mabel had become an acknowledged expert on plant-based remedies. The town physician, Dr. Harrison, often sought her counsel on complementary treatments for ailments that standard medicine struggled to address. They formed a fruitful partnership, merging contemporary scientific methods with ancestral botanical wisdom. Mabel even started recording her discoveries in meticulous journals, contemplating the eventual publication of her studies for the good of the wider medical field. The bond between Martha and Samuel had deepened into something profound and intricate. They not only loved one another, but comprehended each other in ways that went beyond language. Samuel had perceived the shades in Martha's history, the moments she avoided, the events that caused that occasional far-off stare. He never pressed her, trusting that if it was something he needed to know, she would share it in her own time. This very patience and deference made Martha's secrecy feel even heavier. It was in 1923 that Robert Chen's book finally saw print. He had kept his word regarding their anonymity, changing all names, modifying geographic details, and presenting the narrative as a fictional work inspired by true events. The book was titled Shadows of the Mountains and found a wide readership quickly. Reviewers commended the psychological depth of its characters, the manner in which Chen delved into the grey areas of morality. Readers were captivated by the tale of 3 siblings who tread a narrow path between being victims and perpetrators. Martha purchased a copy and read it by herself during a restless night. Chen had been honorable. The specifics were altered sufficiently that no direct link could be made. Yet for her, reading those words was like gazing into a warped looking-glass, recognizing the core of her own existence through a filter of invention. She wept for the first time in many years, not purely from guilt, but from an acknowledgement of the burden she bore, of the lives cut short, of the decisions that could never be reversed. May also read the book and responded differently. She viewed the story as confirmation that they had truly changed, that atonement was attainable. The characters in the novel ultimately found peace, not by erasing the past, but through authentic metamorphosis. May chose to believe this was their reality as well. Mabel refused to read the book entirely, stating that what was done, and digging it up served no constructive end. But Martha observed that Mabel kept a copy concealed beneath her mattress, hinting that even she could not entirely resist the pull of curiosity. Samuel discovered the book in the parlor one day and began to read it idly. He became engrossed in the tale, consuming the entire volume over 2 days. At supper, he remarked on how unsettling yet compelling the story was, and how the female protagonists were both pitiable and frightening. Martha felt her pulse quicken, hoping he would not see the parallel. But Samuel merely said he appreciated stories that explored ethical ambiguity, and then continued with his meal. Life carried on at its measured tempo. Silverton thrived. The mine yielded its ore. The sisters grew older with grace. Martha noticed threads of grey in her once dark hair, the delicate lines forming at the corners of May's eyes, how Mabel's hands grew stiff and sore on chilly mornings. They were entering a new season of life, a time when the past should have been a faint echo, and the future was about securing the legacy they had built. But some legacies cannot be neatly secured, they can only be carried. In 1925, a sudden tragedy occurred. Samuel was examining a newly dug shaft in the mine when a section of the ceiling gave way. Two crucial support timbers splintered, and tons of stone fell before the crew could react. Samuel was struck not by the main collapse, but was thrown violently against the tunnel wall by the concussive force. He lived, but sustained grave damage to his internal organs. Dr. Harrison did all that was within his power, but the medicine of the era had its limits. Samuel spent 3 weeks drifting between awareness and feverish dreams. Martha scarcely left his bedside, clasping his hand, murmuring words of comfort. May and Mabel took shifts, ensuring someone was always there. Mabel prepared every herbal concoction she knew to fight pain and swelling, but Samuel's body was failing in a way that no plant could mend. During his clearer moments, he spoke of his regrets, of things he wished he had accomplished, places he wished he had seen. On one such occasion, Samuel gripped Martha's hand with a strength that belied his weakened state. He said he knew she held things back, that there were chapters from her life before Silverton that remained closed to him. He said it made no difference, that he loved the woman she was now, not the person she might have once been. He asked for only one thing: that she continue to be that person after he was gone, that she not allow the shades of yesterday to consume the light she had discovered. Martha gave him her word, her voice cracking for the first time since his illness began. She finally let her tears fall, decades of dammed-up emotion breaking free. Samuel offered a faint smile, touched her cheek gently, and closed his eyes. He passed from this life peacefully just before sunrise, with Martha, May, and Mabel gathered around his bed, the final witnesses to a life that had been the catalyst for their own redemption. The burial service was an event for the entire community. It seemed as if every soul in Silverton had come to offer their respects. Samuel had been a good man, just to his workers, charitable to his neighbors, always ready to lend a hand to anyone in need. People shared recollections of his decency, of times he had made a positive mark on their lives. Martha listened to every tribute, committing them to memory like invaluable jewels. She understood that Samuel had left behind a true legacy of goodness, something the sisters were still learning to build. After the service, Martha was faced with a pivotal choice. She could continue to run the mine, maintaining the enterprise they had constructed together, or she could sell it. She could use the funds to begin something entirely new. May and Mabel left the decision to her, respecting that it was the widow's right to choose. Martha spent weeks in contemplation, visiting the mine each day, touching the tools Samuel had used, breathing the air thick with remembrance. In the end, she decided to sell, not from an inability to manage, but because the mine represented a chapter that had reached its conclusion. Samuel had been the heart of that place, and without him, it was merely a hole in the earth that produced metal. Martha sold the operation to a consortium of investors from Denver for a fair price, ensuring the workers would keep their positions under the new ownership. With the capital, she proposed to her sisters that they do something significant, something that would honor Samuel's memory while carving a path for their own future. The idea came to them on a winter's night as the three sisters sat by the hearth, watching the flames dance. Martha suggested they use the money from the sale to create something that would benefit the town in an enduring way. Not a single charitable gift, but a lasting establishment that would continue to assist people long after they were gone. May proposed a school for young women, a place where girls could learn not just household arts, but also bookkeeping, business management, and even mineralogy if they desired. Mabel suggested a medical facility that integrated modern practices with traditional herbal knowledge. After much deliberation and planning, they resolved to do both. They would purchase a suitable plot of land and construct a complex that would house both a school and a clinic, twin institutions addressing the community's needs for education and wellness. It was a bold undertaking, one that would consume nearly all the resources they had, but it felt correct in a way that few things in their lives ever had. It was a method of setting things right, of contributing rather than consuming, of creating rather than ruining. Work commenced in the spring of 1926. They employed an architect from Denver who drafted plans for practical yet graceful buildings, structures that would blend with the rugged mountain scenery. The school was to have 6 instructional rooms, a reading room, and a dedicated space for hands-on learning. The clinic would contain spaces for patient assessments, a room for minor surgeries, an apothecary for remedies, and a few cots for those requiring overnight care. Martha managed the finances and the timeline. May designed the program of study, and Mabel coordinated the medical provisions and established standard procedures for care. The work advanced slowly, but consistently. They hired townspeople for the labor, providing good wages for many months. The community observed with keen interest, initially doubtful of the project's success, but gradually coming to believe it might truly come to pass. The sisters came to the building site each day, conferring with the foreman, solving the inevitable issues, and keeping the progress moving forward whenever obstacles arose. During this period, Martha received a letter from an unexpected source. It was from a woman named Elizabeth Thornton, the daughter of the former sheriff who had once pursued their case in West Virginia. Elizabeth explained that her father had recently died, leaving behind personal journals that detailed the unresolved investigations from his career. In reading them, she had found extensive writings about the sisters, observations her father had never revealed publicly. Elizabeth was not making any threats. She simply wished them to know that someone had comprehended their situation, even if it could never be proven in a court of law. Martha read the letter over several times, her hands shaking faintly. Elizabeth wrote that her father, Sheriff Thornton, had reflected on their case for years after the trial. He believed they were culpable, but also saw that they were shaped by merciless conditions, women doing what they felt was needed to endure in a pitiless environment. He had chosen not to reopen the case after the verdict, not for a lack of clues, but because he held the belief that justice could sometimes mean permitting people to become something new. Elizabeth concluded by saying she shared her father's view and wished the sisters tranquility in their remaining years. Martha showed the letter to May and Mabel. May cried quietly, moved by the unanticipated empathy from a man they had only ever seen as an adversary. Mabel remained outwardly unmoved, but Martha saw how her knuckles turned white as she gripped the table's edge. They debated sending a reply, but concluded that no response was the wisest course. Some dialogues were better left uninitiated, some understandings held more power when they remained unvoiced. Martha stored the letter in a small chest with other vital papers, a testament that even in the bleakest of times, she had been shown a glimmer of humanity. The school and clinic opened their doors in September of 1927, with a ceremony that attracted almost every resident of Silverton. The mayor gave an address commending the sisters' foresight and philanthropy. Dr. Harrison spoke about the clinic's capacity to transform healthcare in the area. Several women who had been May's students shared their thanks for the instruction they had received and their excitement that such chances were now available to others. The sisters themselves spoke only for a short time. Martha thanked the town for welcoming them. May dedicated the school to every woman who envisioned a future larger than the one tradition dictated. Mabel voiced her aspiration that the clinic would preserve life and ease anguish. In the months that followed, both establishments flourished. The school registered 40 pupils in its inaugural year, young women keen to acquire abilities that would unlock doors previously shut to them. May taught several courses herself, uncovering a calling for instruction she had not fully known she possessed. Martha handled the organizational duties, making certain the school was supplied with the necessary materials and competent instructors. The clinic attended to dozens of patients each week, with Mabel working with Dr. Harrison and 2 newly hired nurses. Care was provided at modest costs and entirely without charge for those who could not pay. Tales of success began to accumulate. A woman who learned bookkeeping at the school secured a position at a bank in a larger city. A sufferer with a persistent skin ailment incurable by standard means, found respite through one of Mabel's salves. The girl who had never imagined an education beyond the elementary level, discovered a love for poetry and earned a place at a college. Each account was a confirmation, proof that the sisters' investment was yielding priceless returns in the form of altered destinies. Yet, not all was ideal. A handful of people in the town still watched the sisters with mistrust, murmuring about enigmatic backgrounds and suggesting that such extreme charity was an effort to atone for concealed wrongdoings. There were those who claimed that women without children of their own had no business teaching the young, and that knowledge of herbs was perilously near to sorcery. These voices were few, but they were occasionally audible, serving as reminders that full and total acceptance was never guaranteed. Martha met this criticism with a poise refined over many years. She did not justify herself, she did not debate, she simply persevered with her work, allowing the outcomes to serve as her argument. May was more vulnerable, wounded by the unjust remarks. But she learned to use that hurt to fuel a greater devotion to her pupils. Mabel paid the whispers no mind whatsoever, too absorbed in her medical studies to bother with the views of those who lacked understanding of either science or sympathy. In 1929, the globe was rattled by an economic disaster that would be remembered as the Great Depression. Financial systems disintegrated, banks shuttered, enterprises collapsed, and joblessness rose to disastrous levels. Silverton, like every other town, endured profound hardship. Mines closed as ore values crashed. Households lost their entire savings, and a mood of despondency settled over the community like a thick mist. The sisters' school and clinic encountered tremendous strain as their funds shrank and the need for their services swelled. Martha was forced to make painful decisions. They reduced their own stipends to nothing, subsisting on the modest reserves they had left. They eliminated all unnecessary costs, appealed for contributions from every possible source, and even sold personal items to keep their projects alive. The school offered fewer courses, but remained open. The clinic started to accept payment in goods or labor when patients had no currency. It was an era of pure survival, a trial of their dedication that would prove whether their mission was authentic or merely an act. The sisters demonstrated it was authentic. Throughout the most severe years of the Depression, when it would have been reasonable to close down, they persisted. May taught bigger classes to make up for having fewer teachers. Mabel worked extended hours at the clinic, often tending to the sick late into the evening. Martha pleaded, bartered, and improvised, unearthing resources where none seemed to exist. The town eventually recognized their sacrifice, and those who had anything to spare began to donate, forming a web of communal support that carried the institutions through an unthinkable period. It was during this time that Martha became sick. It started as exhaustion, which she blamed on overwork, then developed into a continual cough that did not improve with Mabel's treatments. Dr. Harrison insisted on a comprehensive evaluation, and the prognosis was severe. Martha had tuberculosis, an illness that ravaged countless lives in that time, especially those whose constitutions were weakened by strain and privation. The treatments available were few, consisting mainly of rest and proper sustenance luxuries that were difficult to justify when so many people relied on her. Martha fought the diagnosis with her typical resolve. She kept working, insisting there was too much to be done and too little time for convalescence. But the physical form has boundaries that even the strongest determination cannot overrule. Her vigor faded visibly. Her cough grew more persistent, and finally, May and Mabel had to step in. They assumed control of Martha's duties, insisting she remain in her room to rest, and applied every bit of their healing wisdom. Mabel concocted specific herbal infusions and strengthening elixirs, anything that might offer aid. May remained seated at the bedside, reading to her or simply keeping a silent vigil, her hand in Martha's. During these days of obligatory rest, Martha found time to contemplate the long path their lives had taken. Her mind drifted back to the Appalachians, where their story started, the decisions they had faced and the outcomes they had endured. She remembered Samuel and the unforeseen affection that had altered everything. She thought of the school and the clinic, a physical inheritance that would persist in aiding people long after they had departed. There were, without question, sorrows, but there was also atonement. Not a perfect cleansing, for some things can never be fully washed away, but enough to bring a measure of tranquility. May devoted countless sleepless nights to Martha's care, unwilling to relegate the task entirely to the hired nurses. It was just the three of them again, as it had always been at their core, and May would not let a single valuable moment slip away. They spoke of fond recollections, revisiting the brighter days while consciously steering clear of the darker ones. They recalled how Mabel had first shown an aptitude for botany as a girl, how May had always possessed a gift for crafting beauty with her fingers, how Martha had been blessed with a keen intellect that could have led her to great places under different stars. Mabel maintained a strict schedule, dividing her time between the clinic and the house, refusing to let any of her obligations falter. She was the most reserved of the three, but Martha could perceive a deep affection in every attentive action, in every meticulously measured medicine, in every worried glance. The three siblings had shared decades, had endured trials that would have broken most people, and had emerged on the other side fundamentally altered, yet still bound by ties that could not be severed. Martha's return to health was gradual, but it was constant. The tuberculosis did not vanish entirely, settling into a lasting condition she would have to manage for the rest of her days, but she regained enough strength to take up some of her work again, though at a much gentler rhythm. The sisters modified how they shared their labors, each one taking on the roles that best matched their current capacities. Martha concentrated on long-term strategy and gathering funds. May broadened the school's offerings. Mabel persisted with her medical studies and direct patient care. The years that followed brought a slow return of stability as the nation gradually recovered from the Depression. Silverton never quite regained its former boomtown vigor, but it discovered a new, quieter balance. The school and the clinic had become foundational to the town, establishments upon which future generations would depend. Dozens of young women had already graduated from the school, many attaining accomplishments that would have been unthinkable without the instruction they received. Hundreds of sick and injured had been cared for at the clinic, some with illnesses that would have been lethal without treatment. The sisters aged alongside one another, their hair fading to white, their frames growing more delicate, but their wits remaining as keen as ever. They continued living in the same home, their routines set over a lifetime, offering a familiar comfort and order. They would sit on the veranda on summer evenings, looking out at the peaks that had become their true home. They would stitch quilts together during the deep winter, their hands moving in a harmony perfected over many years. They cared for the garden each spring, sowing the same varieties season after season, preserving a sense of continuity in a world that never stopped changing. There were still moments when the past would resurface without warning, bad dreams that would startle May from her sleep, a faraway look that would cloud Martha's eyes when she believed herself unobserved, Mabel's abrupt, hours-long retreats into silence. In these instances, they leaned on one another, a quiet company that communicated more than speech ever could. They had learned that some weights are never fully set down, only borne with greater dignity as time goes on. The people of Silverton eventually ceased to view the sisters as enigmatic strangers and began to see them as simply a fixed part of the local scenery, as enduring as the mountains around them. Children who had been students returned as grown men and women to share their successes. Patients whose health had been restored came back to express their gratitude. The thankfulness was tangible and sincere, a continuous affirmation that they had built something of enduring worth. Martha died peacefully in 1942, with May and Mabel at her side. She was 63 years old and had lived many years beyond what was first anticipated after her diagnosis. Her funeral was attended by the whole community, with hundreds coming to show their final respects. The mayor proclaimed an official day of mourning. Flags were flown at half-staff and shops closed their doors. It was an acknowledgement of a life that had ultimately been lived with purpose, of a heritage that rose above earlier eras. May carried on for several more years, maintaining the school's operations and teaching for as long as her body allowed. She passed away quietly in her bed in 1947, with Mabel beside her. Mabel was the last one left, living until 1952 and continuing her work at the clinic until mere weeks before the end. She systematically ordered all her research notes, ensuring the knowledge she had gathered would be preserved. When she finally departed, it was with the quiet contentment of knowing her work was complete, The tales of the three sisters slowly melted into local folklore. Specifics were lost, timelines became tangled, truth blended with invention. But the school and the clinic endured, growing over the passing decades, serving generation after generation. Plaques were eventually mounted, paying tribute to the founders who had given so much to establish these institutions. The names Martha, May, and Mabel became forever linked with selfless community work and the potential for personal change. No one in Silverton ever learned the full truth of the sisters' history. Robert Chen's book remained simply an engaging novel, never associated with the real women who had lived in their midst. The gloom of the Appalachian highlands never stretched its fingers as far as Colorado, at least not in any recognizable form. The sisters carried their secrets with them to their final resting place, and those secrets remain buried still. What was left behind was a legacy of atonement, a testament that people are capable of profound change, that the errors of yesterday do not have to permanently dictate tomorrow. The lives they preserved, the learning they imparted, the town they helped to fortify, all of it was real and quantifiable. It was an uneven counterweight to the wrongs they had once committed, but it was something. Perhaps it was even enough. The mountains are silent witnesses to all things, holding tales in their ancient rock, murmuring mysteries on the winds that course through the peaks. They saw Martha, May, and Mabel arrive as tormented refugees, and they saw them depart as women who had found a certain peace. Not a perfect serenity, never that, but a peace attainable for those who bear the burden of complex histories. And perhaps that is the ultimate lesson this story offers, that genuine change is possible even for those whose tales begin in darkness. That a life's work can be reconstructed through steadfast, daily effort over many years. That redemption does not delete the past, but rather charts a new course ahead. The daughters of Appalachia discovered that course, walked it to its conclusion, and left behind something of true value. If you appreciated this exploration into the lives of these three remarkable women, please subscribe to the channel. We would love to hear your thoughts on their story in the comments below.